Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. In today's episode, we'll be speaking with Bill Wilder, who is the Executive Director at Lifecycle Engineering. Bill is the founder and leader of the change management practice right here at LCE, and he's also a ProSci certified advanced instructor. Bill has helped many organizations such as AT&T, Cargill, Pfizer, Alcoa, and the U.S. Navy apply change management in projects and build change management competency.
I'm thrilled today to be interviewing my boss and the director of the Lifecycle Institute, Bill Wilder. He's been leading the change management practice here at Lifecycle Engineering for well over 5 years. And change saturation, the topic of our podcast today, is something that's been becoming more and more frequently encountered. We know that change can be positive when it's controlled, but it can also be negative when it overwhelms organizations with more change than they can handle. So during today's podcast, we're going to address that point of change saturation and how to minimize the risk of creating too much change in your organization. So let's get started. Our first question today for you, Bill, is pretty basic. What is change saturation?
Well, first, let me just say it's a pleasure to be back on the podcast with you guys.
Thanks,
Your
Bill.
ever-growing popularity. It's very impressive what you guys are doing here. But so what is change saturation? Why is it even important? What are we talking about there? Well, as reliability professionals, typically in organizations, we're trying to get organizations to change the way they do things, the way they do their work, to try to move from reactive to proactive, to implement new processes. Well, but with the war for talent, globalization, incredible technology changes taking place all around us on a daily basis, the level of change that people are going through has reached phenomenal levels beyond anything we've ever seen. And this includes both their personal and professional lives, all of which impacts their ability to adapt and absorb new changes. It's ProSci, P-R-O-S-C-I, the global leader in research on this whole issue of change management. Been doing research for 2 decades now. In their studies have found that 78% of the respondents to this survey, which are most of the Fortune 500 and organizations all over the world, say that they are near or past change saturation. They cannot absorb any more change, that the organization's capacity to change has been exhausted. Those same respondents say that change is increasing in spite of that. 72% of them say that in spite of the fact they can't handle any more change, it's still growing. So that's what we mean by change saturation, and that's what we think is a critical issue for people in the reliability field to understand, is how to help the people that they are hoping will help them be successful in implementing their goals or meeting their goals, build change, resilience, and agility. And that's what we mean by change saturation. How does the organization create more capacity for change? If you're at 78% saturation and 72% of you say the change is still coming, then we need to do something proactively to increase our resilience or our agility, our change agility, and our ability and our capacity to manage these changes.
Interesting. So let me just ask you a quick question.
Sure.
Is it that it's too much change at one time? There's like a lot of change initiatives happening at one time, or is it just constant? One change, then we roll into the next change, or is it both?
Well, it's really both, right? So it's the numbers of changes that are going on simultaneously, coupled with the fact that more changes are being heaped on top of that. So, and these are not just, again, changes that are going on in the workplace. I mean, there's changes going on at home. There's changes going on with technology at home as well, or social things going on at home, and all these things impact an individual's resilience. So you might come to me with a little change that normally would be no big deal, but if I'm facing some crisis, financial crisis at home, or family crisis at home, or some crisis at work with my boss, my resilience, my ability to accept that change has been compromised.
So that's our environment. That's where we're living.
Right.
What are the risks of change saturation? It's here. It's not going.
Right.
Change is not going to change.
Right.
So what are those risks that accompany this constant change environment?
Right. There are many risks. We'll just start, I guess, at the top, which is your very ability to compete in the marketplace becomes diminished. If you're competing against people who have greater change agility or resilience than you do, then that means they're going to move faster than you. And that means they're going to attract talent better than you. So there are a lot of implications just from a standpoint of being competitive in the marketplace, both in terms of your ability to deliver value for your client, but also your ability to attract talent in any number of ways that you might be competing. Just within the organization, I mean, obviously, projects are not going to finish on time. They're not going to finish on budget. Projects are going to get started and then they're going to be closed because you can't get them done. People begin to expect that you don't complete projects because there's so many going on that you start them and then they fail. So you get that whole flavor of the month thing. This is going to go away in a few months. And so you begin to build up, even within the organization, a culture that accepts the idea that you don't do change well, so they can get by without having to do the change. But then also, I mean, that filters down into customer impact and filters down into employee engagement, et cetera. So the risks are pretty high, and it's incumbent on organizations to be proactive about doing something about it. And one other risk I guess I would highlight is that if you don't have a formal way for dealing with the portfolio of change going on in your organization, then you're just leaving it at the whims of whoever happens to have the most influence, whoever happens to have their pet project. It may not be the right one. It may not be the project that should actually get completed, but it's going to be based on whoever happens to have the most influence, in an organization or has their little pet project. So,
but that means you have to be aware. You can't be myopic about your change or your project being the only one that's going on.
Right.
You have to have awareness of
Right.
what your stakeholders are going through.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, so now that we understand the concept of what is change saturation and kind of the risks, the negative impacts that has, within an organization, so let's talk about how to identify change saturation, the symptoms of change saturation, so that maybe you can squash it before it starts to impact your business.
Yeah.
Right.
How would we know?
Yeah. Right. So, well, first of all, and again, we'll go back to some of the research from ProSci, right? They've identified how organizations try to understand and measure saturation. And the first thing they cite from the research, and these are the people responding, is that they look for the behaviors, the typical behaviors that people are saturated, higher volume of sick leave, resistance to change via talk or behavior, gossip, refusal to attend informal meetings. You see people stop showing up at meetings, or calling in sick more often, or standing around the water cooler talking about the fact that they can't deal with it anymore.
And then all of a sudden getting really quiet when you walk up.
Right. Yeah. Those are the kinds of symptoms. But there are other ways. I mean, you can through employee engagement surveys, you can see these things. Also, just informal discussions and team meetings, you'll see it and feel it. You can observe the behaviors that are going on, and then higher in the organization, you have a bigger sense of the level of change going on and how critical it is to you. So a lot of it's just intuition. You just feel it yourself. If you're feeling it, there's somebody else feeling it as well. So those are really kind of the ways you sense that it's happening.
So these aren't really quantifiable things that we might be seeing. They're more based on intuition or just observation. How would an organization minimize the risks that are associated with change saturation?
So again, I'll turn to the research and what are people doing about it, right? So how are they managing this and trying to build their change resilience and their overall organizational agility and their ability to really not rely on anecdotal or informal kind of information to give them this heads up that they have an issue, right? So the first thing they do is they manage change in a portfolio form, right? So they have some way of identifying all of the changes in the organization. It's certainly the ones that are the enterprise-wide type changes, whether it be coming from HR or IT or accounting or operations or maintenance and reliability or whoever, that there's some formalized process where any kind of a change like this that gets funded gets put into this portfolio. And these are simple things. Some of these are just tables or spreadsheets. They typically have some kind of an assessment process where they identify who's being impacted by the change. And so they can look at an organization or a group within the organization and say, okay, they have 6 changes going on that impact them, and they have 3, and they have 2, okay, and the level of impact in that organization, as well as other mitigating or other kinds of complicating kind of issues that might be going on, like a new boss in there, or they've got a shortage of talent and they're overloaded, or any kind of new technology thing. So, and it doesn't have to be complicated to do this. But first of all, just some way of documenting that. Then secondly, some kind of a structure around that process for how you manage it. And, it just kind of depends on the organization. If you look at where the portfolio resides, right, if the organization has a PMO, project management office, what do they say? Let's see, I've got the number here. 53% of the respondents said that's where the portfolio management process resides for them. The 24% say it's at the executive level. So there's an executive group, corporate kind of group that's managing and keeping up with this portfolio. And then it kind of goes into IT, HR, and so forth. But those are predominantly where they reside, either in a change management or project management office. And often those are one and the same. And they have a structured way. So you go through the budgeting process to seek funding for this change. Part of that process now includes who's being impacted by the change. What other changes is this group going under? What are the timelines, right? So just a few things doesn't, again, have to be overly complicated. In fact, if it is, you're just going to make matters worse because now you've imposed more change on top of change and just made the matter even more complicated. So first, a portfolio approach. Secondly, some structured process for doing that resides in a specific group, and they carry that responsibility and they know that responsibility. Third is, because of that ability to look at those changes together, you can integrate them. And so your communications integrates the considerations from all the changes. So if, for example, if I'm in accounting and I'm doing, accounts receivables or whatever, and a new SAP system is being installed for that, but at the same time, HR is implementing an employee self-service application over here that I'm going to have to learn how to use, and IT is getting ready to change out my, Outlook or my email server kind of thing. These are all changes I'm going to go in at the same time. If we're managing them individually without any consideration of what the other changes are, I'm getting emails from all of them. And they're all assuming they're the number one priority, and they're all scheduling things for you to do and expectations of you without consideration for what the others are. But now that I have this portfolio approach, when I'm communicating, either from the sponsor or from the manager, it's in the context of all the changes going on. So now I, the recipient of this, feel much better that the organization does understand what I'm going through, and they do know that my email client's being changed out, and I'm having to do this HR self-service thing, and I'm trying to learn this new SAP accounts receivables process. And so when the change comes out or when the communications comes out, or in team meetings and we're talking about changes, these changes are communicated in an integrated fashion. And that just, if nothing else, it helps people feel better about the organization understanding what they're going through. So that's integrate. And really, I've already led into the third, which was this communicate idea, that you are communicating about all the changes, and you're even helping the individual set priorities. So instead of relying on you, Derek, to figure out which one of these is more important, I can only do these two, I can't do all three of them, by integrating that communication, I'm helping you understand from an organizational point of view which of these is a higher priority. So what are they? Portfolio, some kind of a portfolio management process, to a structured process for assessing the impact of that change and how that change is impacting people in the organization, and then an integration of all that information into a holistic, comprehensive communication about the changes going on. Embrace the changes, yeah. Acknowledge the fact that we're at change saturation, and they're going to keep going. And so we're going to start communicating about all the changes instead of letting all these changes go off and do their own thing without consideration of, who else is doing it. So basically, that's it. That's what change saturation is. That's how we recommend you deal with it. And, when we work with folks, mostly in the maintenance and reliability field, but even many organizations call on us just to help them deal with just change. These are some of the things that we help them do to build the organization's change, agility, and resilience. So there you go. All right.
Thank you, Bill.
Is that enough?
That's great for
rambled there
joining
a little
us today. No, I don't think so at all. I
Okay.
think you talked about change saturation, change resilience. You gave some actionable items. I really think our listeners can relate to the constant change environment and to provide some tips like take a portfolio approach, have a structured process, communicate, embrace the change.
Right.
So
Yeah.
thank you for giving our listeners something to hold on to.
So I'll just mention one other thing. So I
Sure.
was at a smart manufacturing conference earlier this year, and the keynote speaker was a guy named John Lundgren. He talked about the fact, and this wasn't a thing about change, he talked about the fact that the reason that he feels like that they were so successful is that at the corporate level, at the CEO's office, when they were considering funding new initiatives, there were 3 questions they would ask. Does it advance our strategy? How much money is it going to cost, and what is my return? And third, what is our organizational capacity to absorb this and execute on this change? And he made the point that it was that third question, that third very elegantly simple question. What is the organizational capacity? Forcing the sponsors of this change to think through that process. He said that's what made the difference and why they were more successful in their strategy deployment than their competitors. So I just urge you to think through that. Is it advancing your strategy? Is you're going to get a good return on your investment? And can the organization even do it? Do they have the capacity?
You heard it here,
Right
podcast
there.
listeners.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again. And I'm going to pass the mic to Derek so he can talk all about the resources that are going to be online. And we'll see you next time.
That's right, Tara. So we do have some extra links that are available in our show notes. And the first resource we have available is a online article. It's called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Communicating Effectively During Major Change. The second link up there is to the LCE Change Management webpage, as well as a link to the ProSci webpage that Bill mentioned earlier in this podcast. And then finally, like all episodes, we have a link to connect with Bill on LinkedIn. Reach out to him, ask him any questions. He's always available. With that being said, we're going to end today's episode, and we appreciate you joining us on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.